Hello again. This is the second video in our three-part video series on the SAT essay. And in this video, we are going to be talking about evidence, reasoning, and style. Not really actually talking about those things, in the way that we would talk about them if we were just talking about them for no reason. We will specifically be talking about them as they apply to the SAT essay, because that's, of course, what we're here for. And just like every other concept that is tested on the SAT, we're going to find that the role played by these three ideas in the process of writing the SAT essay is a bit more limited and test-specific and standardized than it would be in real life. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we talk about those things, let me make sure that we're all here for the right reasons. So here is the reason you should be watching this video. This video is, like I said, the second one in a three-part series. I would recommend that you watch this video after having watched the first of the three videos, of course. In that first video, I kind of lay out the entire situation, what's going on with the SAT essay, how you should attack the SAT essay on test day, what kinds of things actually get rewarded on the SAT essay as opposed to the things that the College Board publishes in the rubric and says will be rewarded, and all of that kind of stuff. So that video, that first video, really gives the context that's necessary to understand what's going on in this video. In this video, we are going to be talking again about evidence, reasoning, and style, or appeals to emotion or persuasive elements or whatever, specifically, again, as they apply to the SAT essay. And then in video 3, which I am assuming you have not watched yet, you will see some analyses of top-scoring sample essays provided to us by the College Board. And in that video, you will see that the things discussed in the first two videos are found in actual top-scoring essays written by actual people, just like yourself. And before we leave this screen, I just want to call your attention back to this phrase. Hopefully, as I said, you've watched the first video, but in case you haven't watched it, or more likely, even if you watched it and you weren't like super paying attention at the beginning, which I don't blame you for because it's the SAT essay, it's not super exciting. Anyway, I would be doing you a disservice if I did not remind you at the beginning of this video that for most people who want to apply to most colleges and universities in the United States, the SAT essay doesn't matter. In other words, most schools don't use the SAT essay by their own admission. And as I argue in the first video, even the schools that do say they require the SAT essay score, if you look at what they're actually doing with their data, their admissions, and all that other stuff, it really, really strongly seems like they don't even look at the scores either. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, then go back to the beginning of the first video in this series and kind of get up to speed with that. Because as I said, for most people, if you really want to work on the SAT in a way that's going to improve your chances of being admitted to your target schools, then you should be focusing on the multiple choice parts of the test, because those are the parts that schools and universities will definitely consider when deciding whether to let you in. So anyway, that is how to use this video. Now that we're all on the same page, that we're here to talk about evidence, reasoning, style, and emotion as they pertain to the SAT essay, let's get started. Now, you may be wondering, why do we even care about these specific terms that I keep repeating? Evidence, reasoning, style, emotion, etc. Why does that even matter when it comes to the SAT essay? Because there's a very good chance that for most of the essays you've written in high school, and certainly most of the ones you will write in college, you're never really required to use those terms, and they aren't specifically mentioned by professors when they give you the prompt for an essay and so on. But on the SAT essay, most of those terms are specifically mentioned in the prompt. And the use of those terms in the SAT essay prompt is a big clue from the College Board about what kinds of things you might want to be talking about in your discussion of the argument that appears in the passage. And so being aware of what these terms mean and what the College Board is thinking about when it uses these terms in the prompt can help you structure your approach to the task of writing the SAT essay. First of all, when you are reading the provided passage, these ideas of evidence, reasoning, etc., will help you kind of like filter and categorize the things that you're seeing. As you go from paragraph to paragraph of the original passage, you'll be able to be like, oh, I see here, like this sentence is sort of being presented as like a factual piece of evidence. And then this sentence a little bit later is explaining why that evidence is relevant, all of those kinds of things that we'll talk about. And when you're able to structure your reading and you're thinking about the passage in this kind of way, then everything flows a lot more easily when it actually comes time to write the essay using the process that we talked about in that first video. And by the way, of course, I don't want you to think from what I just said that you can't use the terms evidence and reasoning and so on in your essay. You can if you want to use them. I'm just trying to say that we're not devoting a video to those terms because you have to use the terms. Use them if you want to use them, don't use them if you don't want to use them, but whether you use the terms or not, having a solid grasp of the concepts behind those terms will help you a lot when it comes to discussing the provided passage as required by the College Board. And so in terms of that structure, basically what we are going to find is that the evidence, reasoning, and style that are mentioned specifically in the SAT essay prompt kind of have set relationships to each other in terms of how they help the author get her point across in a passage. And these first two, evidence and reasoning, these are more based in logic, again, at least as far as the SAT is concerned. And I'll expand on this more in the next couple of screens, but basically when we're talking or thinking about evidence, we want to be thinking about facts. Or in other words, like things that happened, things everyone agrees on for purposes of the SAT essay. So these could be things like historical events or numerical data, stuff like that. And then reasoning is the thought process that connects the evidence to whatever the argument is trying to prove. And we'll explore more specifically what evidence and reasoning can actually look like in the passage on test day. But for now, again, it's just important to remember that evidence and reasoning go along with the idea of logical thinking as far as the College Board is concerned. But on the other hand, when we talk about the passage's use of style or emotion or persuasive elements or those kinds of ideas, then we're specifically talking about something that's not based in logic. Instead, we're talking about the ways that the author phrases things to get us to feel the same emotions that the author feels. And so that's basically how we want to divide these things mentally. Evidence and reasoning, again, are grounded in logic for our purposes here, and then style and emotion are grounded in, well, emotions. And this, by the way, is one of the reasons why I recommend in the first video that you save your discussion of style and emotion for the last body paragraph, because it might disorient the grader if you had like one body paragraph about the logical evidence reasoning stuff in one part of the passage, and then the next body paragraph is about style, emotional stuff, and then you go back to another body paragraph later about logical things from another part of the passage. There's a concern that that kind of an arrangement might make the essay feel disorganized when the reader is skimming through it in the minute or two that they're going to spend reading it, again, as we discussed in the first passage. So that's one reason to put the emotion and style body paragraph last. The other main reason to do it, the more important reason actually, is that when you look at top scoring SAT essays, you see that a whole bunch of them put a paragraph about emotions and stuff as the last body paragraph before the conclusion. And as we discussed in the first video, since that's what a whole bunch of top scoring essays do, then that's what you should also do. So now let's go ahead and start talking about each of these concepts in a little bit more detail. We'll start with evidence, of course. And as I mentioned before, we want to think of evidence in terms of facts, numbers, dates, places, names, those kinds of things. And as it's going to turn out in most passages, basically any kind of statement made by the author of the passage could be viewed as evidence for our purposes in writing this essay. And another way to think of evidence, in case it helps, is to sort of like imagine, if you've ever seen like a TV show or a movie that's set in a courtroom, imagine the types of things that a lawyer might say or introduce to help prove his case. And if the lawyer in the TV show was trying to prove the thesis that appears in the passage, then the types of things that lawyer might say, you're also going to see that the passage, makes those kinds of statements as well. And again, for our purposes, that's all evidence. And there are a lot of different forms that these kinds of evidence statements can take, but I would argue that we're going to notice three main groups in most of the passages provided by the College Board, and I have those here in no particular order. So group one is numbers and statistics. So these would be statements like 19% of visitors to our national parks return again within 1 year. That would be a statistical sort of statement presented again as a piece of evidence. Or something like Chicago is the second largest city in the United States, which I don't even know if that's true. But, those kinds of numbers-based statements would be one type of evidence. And another type of evidence, of course, would be historical and political events. So things like the American Civil War ended in 1865, and so on. And another type of evidence could be things like personal stories, possibly directly involving the author or possibly just things the author heard from somebody. And that could be something like, the other day I was taking a walk in the park and I noticed that the water in the river had trash in it. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, gosh, Mike, there's way more than three kinds of evidence in real life. Why are you singling out those three kinds of evidence? The main reason I'm mentioning those here is just that those are the ones we tend to see coming up a lot in SAT passages. And more importantly, it doesn't really matter how you categorize the types of evidence that you run into. Just like we said before, how it doesn't really matter if you actually even use the term evidence in your essay. What's more important in both cases is just that you're starting to structure your thinking roughly along these types of lines. So again, we want to think of evidence in terms of statements that are presented as fact. And we want to start getting used to the idea that those types of statements introduced as fact can sort of be roughly grouped into buckets of similar kinds of statements, and that these three types of statements are things you're very likely to encounter when you look at a passage provided by the College Board for the SAT essay. So that's all. If you're looking at a passage on test day and you don't feel like it's mentioning any kinds of numbers or statistics, you're probably right. It's probably not. So don't worry about that and think about instead the types of evidence that it is presenting. But I just threw these things out here as very common types of evidence that you might see on test day. And next we will address reasoning, which for our purposes is basically some kind of statement explaining why the evidence has anything to do with what the passage is trying to argue, with the thesis of the passage. And often, but not always, we will find that the author will directly tell us how he thinks a particular piece of evidence supports the argument in the passage. And of course, it's nice for us as readers and SAT essay writers when the passage just directly connects a dot between a piece of evidence and a thesis. But it doesn't always play out like that. A lot of times the reasoning isn't directly stated at all. We just have a piece of evidence and then the author sort of leaves it up to the reader to figure out why that piece of evidence is directly relevant to the argument. And the author of the passage might leave the reasoning out because he thinks it seems so obvious that it's not worth stating, or he might leave the reasoning out because he just doesn't care if you figure out why the evidence connects to his argument. And so one other way to kind of frame this relationship between evidence and reasoning is to use something that I call the what, why, how model. And actually it should be more like what as one thing to think about, and then why, how as sort of a separate second thing instead of three evenly spaced question words like I typed it out originally. But anyway, yeah, this what, why, how thing is just sort of one more way to start getting your head around how evidence and reasoning can relate to each other in terms of the logical side of the passages that you might see on test day. So when we read a couple of sentences or a paragraph or maybe even a single sentence of a passage from the SAT essay, we might first ask ourselves in that selected text, what fact is the author citing in this sentence, or what fact did the author just say in the last 2 or 3 sentences? And the answer to that question is going to be a piece of evidence. Like I said, we'll see examples of applying this to a real passage in just a moment. And then once we've identified the evidence, we can say to ourselves, okay, so why is the author introducing this particular piece of evidence right now? Why does the author think that this piece of evidence is connected to the argument in the essay? And the answer to that question is going to be the reasoning that goes with that particular piece of evidence. Or another way to frame basically the same question is to ask ourselves, how does that cited piece of evidence help convince the reader that the author is correct? And so you can see again, as I just said, why and how are basically the same sort of question for our purposes here. And they both get us to start thinking about what the author's reasoning was for providing a particular piece of evidence that we discovered with the what question. And so now for the next couple of screens, I'm going to walk us through some text pulled out of passages provided by the College Board for the SAT essay and kind of show you this whole evidence, reasoning, what, why, how kind of analysis. So you can kind of see it in action and keep building up this framework in your head. So here's the first example that I want to walk us through. And this one is going to be based on the prompt that currently appears on the College Board's website as the second available SAT essay practice prompt. I don't know when you're watching this video if it will still be up there or not, but it's up there now. And what you see here is the key part of the prompt that we talked about in the first video. And this part of the prompt tells us that the author of the passage is writing to persuade his audience that the decline of reading in America will have a negative effect on society. So when we're talking about how the evidence and reasoning will help to prove the author's thesis, this is the thesis statement for this particular essay. And again, as we discussed in the first video, that's the thesis as formulated by the College Board and given to us to work with. So everything that we write in our essay is going to be based on how the author helps to prove that thesis. In this case, the statement that the decline of reading in America will have a negative effect on society. So in order to show you this example, I've pulled out a couple of paragraphs from the essay that went along with that prompt. And I did this, of course, because I can't fit the entire essay on the screen, and it would be tedious to read the whole essay over and over again for each example anyway. So let's go ahead and read these 2 paragraphs, by which I mean I am going to read them and you're going to listen to me. And you can read them along if you want or not. So it says, the evidence of literature's importance to civic, personal, and economic health is too strong to ignore. The decline of literary reading foreshadows serious long-term social and economic problems, and it is time to bring literature and the other arts into discussions of public policy. Libraries, schools, and public agencies do noble work, but addressing the reading issue will require the leadership of politicians and the business community as well. ... That's 4 dots in a row. Reading is not a timeless, universal capability. Advanced literacy is a specific intellectual skill and social habit that depends on a great many educational, cultural, and economic factors. As more Americans lose this capability, our nation becomes less informed, active, and independent-minded. These are not the qualities that a free, innovative, or productive society can afford to lose. So, okay, let's pretend that we are working on this prompt on test day. We're looking at this passage, and we're reading it again with the idea that the thesis is the decline of reading in America will have a negative effect on society. So we see these 2 paragraphs, and we might start out by asking ourselves, well, what is a plain, direct statement that is being made by these 2 paragraphs? And my answer to that question here is basically literature is important to society. That's essentially just a boiling down of that sentence right there, which says the evidence of literature's importance to civic, personal, and economic health is too strong to ignore, which is the same thing as saying literature is important, right? The evidence is too strong to ignore means it's true. Literature is important. And important to what? I just shortened all of these words, civic, personal, economic health. I just shortened that to society. And it's okay that I kind of shortened it because all of this stuff here, this is, like we've been talking about, this is just to help me mentally understand what is the author actually claiming, what is being set forth as a statement of fact in the bits of text that are on the screen. And there are many statements of facts, there are many pieces of evidence here, but the one I'm singling out is the idea that literature is important to society. And then, in order to help myself think about the reasoning here, I ask myself, why does the author mention this at this point? How does the author think that this is going to help support the thesis? And again, the thesis is the decline of reading in America will have a negative effect on society. Now, in this particular case, the reasoning or the connection between this idea of literature being important and this idea of the thesis, the connection between those 2 ideas is actually basically stated by the author in the paragraphs I pulled out for you. And I kind of paraphrased that statement here and said, the decline of literary reading will hurt society. As we lose this capability, we contribute to a society that's less free and innovative. Again, these are my words here. If this is test day, I'm not bothering to take notes and write down what I just put on the screen for you here. All that I'm putting sort of over here in these bullet points is just kind of my thought process. And the thought process I would encourage you to have as you're looking at these particular paragraphs. We ask ourselves what is being stated here, and why does the author believe that this is an idea that's connected to the thesis? How does the author think that citing this is going to help get us to believe the thesis? And as I just said, I basically took my rough paraphrasing idea of what is being the reasoning here, more or less from this sentence. The author said the decline of literary reading foreshadows serious long-term social and economic problems. I just shortened that too. The decline of literary reading will hurt society, right? Foreshadows means it tells us something is going to happen. And the idea of having social and economic problems is basically the idea of hurting society, right? Social, society, problems, hurting, bad. You get the idea. This is just my paraphrasing of that. And I also paraphrased this sentence down here. As more Americans lose this capability, our nation becomes less informed, active, and independent-minded. I wrote, as we lose this capability, we contribute to a society that's less free and innovative. Oh, and I kind of borrowed those terms from here. So yeah, by using this what and why, how kind of thought process, I've been able to kind of start seeing the relationships among the concepts that the author is putting together here in these 2 paragraphs. And then if this were test day and I wanted to turn these observations into a body paragraph or into a large part of a body paragraph, then that's when I would start writing, and I would start writing based on these bullet ideas, which, like I said, are just in my head up till now. They're not things I would ever bother to write down in real life. They're only on the screen now, so I can help get across what kinds of things I would be thinking about. And so now I'll show you some of the body text from this that might end up in my essay. And I'm going to start by shrinking down all of this text over here into the corner, because otherwise there won't be enough room to fit my own writing on the screen. And I might write something like what's on the screen now. Before we read this, I want to be really clear. You don't have to write exactly this paragraph in the same way that I did. You don't even have to think of the structure of this part of the text in the exact way that I thought about it. Even if you apply the what, why, how kind of thinking, you might pull out a different what and a different why and a different how. So if you're looking at the text that I just wrote and you're thinking, I would never have written it that way, that's perfectly fine. That's really not a problem. I'm just showing one way that we could take the ideas we just saw in those two paragraphs from the passage and think about them in terms of what and why and how, and kind of put something together that takes up space on our sheets of paper that we're writing the essay on. If you remember from the first video, taking up space is super important. So so I might have written something like Gioia. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Gioia, something G. Also includes abstract statements about the nature of society and even about literacy itself, which encourage the reader to consider basic properties of those concepts and realize that a love of literature is necessary to a free, innovative, productive society. So let's see what that sentence of mine is trying to do. You remember possibly from the first video and from earlier in this video when I talked about the idea that there are a wide variety of different types of evidence we might encounter on test day, different types of statements of fact that are put forward. For me, when I read these statements about literature being important to civic, personal, and economic health, and the idea of literacy being a specific intellectual skill and social habit that depends on a great many other factors, and I asked myself, okay, like what kind of evidence is this? What came to mind right away is just, okay, it's sort of an abstract statement. And that's why I started my sentence by saying, Gioia also includes abstract statements. If you wanted to describe those statements differently, then you could say Gioia also includes whatever kind of statement you think it is. And notice that basically starting around here or so, for the rest of my text here that I've supplied, a lot of what I wrote there is just sort of like repurposed and remixed text and ideas from the parts of the passage that are on the screen. And I've done a bit of quoting here. You remember from the first video, hopefully, that we want to have our quotes be roughly 10 to 15% of the text. I haven't bothered to count how much is quoted here or not. This feels like maybe it's a little on the heavy quotation side, but I could balance that out elsewhere in the essay by quoting a little bit less than 10 or 15% for other parts. And so that is basically that. And notice again, as we discussed a second ago, that for this particular example, it could be strongly argued that the author's reasoning is basically directly stated in multiple parts of the text on the screen. Because again, the reasoning is the idea that connects the author's cited evidence to the thesis. And we said the thesis is the idea of the decline of reading in America having a negative effect on society in the future. And here, for example, we have a sentence, the decline of literary reading foreshadows serious problems, which is actually almost even a direct restatement of the College Board's idea of the thesis, and kind of neatly explains why this previous sentence is provided here by the author. But, as we just said a few minutes ago, sometimes the author does not directly provide the reasoning in the passage, so let's go ahead and take a look at an example of how that could play out. So here is the second evidence and reasoning example that I wanted to show you, and this is based once more on the same essay with the same thesis, that thesis again being everything that comes after the word that, basically, which is the decline of reading in America will have a negative effect on society. And here are some other paragraphs from the same essay. And let's go ahead and read those, or listen to me read them. We have, according to the 2002 Survey of Public Participation in the Arts, a population study designed and commissioned by the National Endowment for the Arts and executed by the U.S. Bureau of the Census, arts participation by Americans has declined for 8 of the 9 major forms that are measured, ... The declines have been most severe among younger adults ages 18 to 24. The most worrisome finding in the 2002 study, however, is the declining percentage of Americans, especially young adults, reading literature. And then later in the essay, the decline of reading is also taking its toll in the civic sphere, ... A 2003 study of 15 to 26-year-old civic knowledge by the National Conference of State Legislatures concluded, young people do not understand the ideals of citizenship, ... only 3 that time, and their appreciation and support of American democracy is limited. So in this case, for me, again, pretending that it's test day, as I would be looking through these paragraphs and thinking in terms of the College Board's definition of the thesis, which is this statement, what would kind of leap out at me is that the author is referring to scientific surveys and studies that were done and talking about demographic trends and that kind of thing. And so if I ask myself, what specific objective facts is the author citing here? My answer might be something along the lines of the fact that studies in 2002 and 2003 showed declining arts or reading participation and low civic knowledge. And again, just like in the previous example, this is just sort of my thought process here that I'm trying to put in front of you. I'm not saying that I would actually take notes that say what's here in this bullet item or that I would write it down myself anywhere or anything like that. This is just sort of my initial impression as a reader. Oh, the author is talking about studies done in the early 2000s, and those studies seem to show both a lack of knowledge about citizenship and stuff and a decline in reading literature. So, okay, now that I've noticed that that is an objective fact being put forward by the author of the passage, I have to ask myself, well, why is the author of the passage mentioning that fact while trying to prove that the decline of reading in America will have a negative effect on society? How does the author think that citing this fact is going to help us readers come to understand that the thesis must be correct? And if I look around in the passage itself, I arguably don't see a direct statement of why this objective fact here about the studies would have to support the thesis. And so I basically have to come up with my own idea of the author's reasoning. Remember, we said a lot of times when the reasoning goes unstated, it's because the author probably considers the reasoning to be so obvious that it doesn't necessarily need to be stated. And in this case, we kind of have that sort of situation. So the author does explicitly say that these studies show an existing decline and that this decline is already affecting society. And so the kind of unstated implication is, since this is already happening and these are trends we're talking about, then these trends will probably continue and have a negative effect on society in the future. And notice again that the thesis is focused on the future, whereas these two paragraphs are focused on something that has already happened. So again, the kind of small logical leap is to recognize that, well, the author seems to be saying that because it's already happening, we can expect it will continue to happen. And there you go. That's your connection to the thesis, which is talking about the future. And so as we kind of reflect on those ideas in terms of evidence and reasoning, or in terms of what and why and how, then we might come up with some text like the following. And just like with the previous example, I'm not in any way suggesting that you should write something exactly like this or even really close to that. Because when you look at these two paragraphs, you might decide to focus on a different objective fact being put forward, or you might not even want to talk about survey results and things like that in your essay. And so you might just skip over this and focus on other types of evidence and reasoning found elsewhere in the essay. So again, these kinds of like selections of sample text that I'm showing you, this is just sort of to get the wheels turning. This is the kind of thing you might have decided to write after having the thought process we just talked about. And so if this were test day, I might have written, Gioia refers to multiple studies done by national organizations establishing objective credibility by citing hard data. He shows that, quote, arts participation by Americans has declined, end quote, especially when it comes to, quote, reading literature, end quote. He then combines this with a finding that young people do not understand the ideals of citizenship, inviting the reader to make a mental connection between the present decline in reading and the lack of civics knowledge. The clear implication is that this trend will only continue to have a negative effect on society in the future. And so here you can see basically in this part of the text, in this particular time around, I was focused on discussing the evidence put forward by the author, which is the survey data. And I kind of spent a sentence or so describing exactly what sort of evidence was being cited and describing that evidence a little bit, kind of almost being redundant when I talk about like objective credibility and hard data. I really probably didn't need to say both of those things, but we want to remember again that on the SAT essay, as discussed in the first video, it's really important to fill up as much space on the page as you can. And so you kind of want to expand on your sentences a little bit in this kind of way if you can make it come off a little bit naturally. And so anyhow, at the end down here of this selection of text is where I put my statement of what the author's reasoning must have been in deciding to include these two pieces of survey data. And notice in this example, I didn't ever use the word evidence or the word reasoning. The closest I really came to that, I guess, is I talked about what Gioia cited, and I guess by definition you kind of cite evidence. But I talked about what was being cited without calling it evidence, and I talked about what was being implied without actually calling it reasoning. And that's fine. Once more, the point of this whole evidence reasoning model and the whole what, why, how kind of way of thinking about it is just to help you structure your thinking and give you ideas of things to say, things to talk about, as you fill up 2.5 pages of discussion of the passage. And so now that we've talked a bit about evidence and reasoning, we've seen a couple of examples of how we might use that sort of thinking on real passages from the College Board's essay training. Let's turn our attention now to the more emotional and style-based kinds of concepts that we're also addressing in this video. You'll remember we talked about how evidence and reasoning are more about the logical aspects of the author's argument, and how this other stuff, style and emotion and so on, is all about how the author tries to play on the way we feel. With the idea, basically, that if the person making the argument, if the author, can sort of use words in a way that get us to have the same feelings as the ones the author has, then that will in turn make the reader more likely to agree with the author. So this is the part of the argument that's playing more on human sympathy and human empathy rather than presenting a solid, like, logical argument like the other stuff we just talked about. And by the way, your English teacher may refer to this idea of playing on sympathy or whatever as pathos. I'm actually not sure how you pronounce it. I'm realizing now when I say that. Well, you don't say that someone is pathetic, you say pathetic. So it's probably pathos, I don't know, whatever. The point is, here's this word. It wasn't used commonly in English class discussions when I was in English class back a million years ago. It is somewhat commonly used now, from what I hear. And to be clear, my personal exposure to it has only come in written form, which is why I don't know how to say it. But the point is, anyway, your teacher may have used this term to describe the idea of an author's attempt to create an emotional common ground with the reader as basically a way to trick the reader into abandoning logic and evidence and stuff and just sort of feeling like the author must be correct because the reader now shares the same feelings on the subject as the author. But anyway, whatever you want to call this, for our purposes where the SAT essay is concerned, all these emotional aspects, these pathos aspects of the essay can basically be thought of in terms of strong adjectives and adverbs, or extreme adjectives and adverbs, or whatever you want to call them. And if you don't feel super confident recognizing what's an adjective or an adverb versus some other part of speech, then we can just sort of think about these extreme words, these strong words, as any kind of word that you might see in the passage that could be defined with a two-word phrase, including the word very. And that might sound super complicated the way I just said it, but let me give you a couple of examples and then it'll make a bit more sense. So we could have, for example, the word severe that might appear in the passage. And severe basically means like very serious, right? So we would know from that severe is a pretty strong word that's likely to affect the reader's emotions. Another one would be the word worrisome, which means like very bad enough that it would cause you to worry. Or another word could be something like swiftly, which means like very quickly, extremely quickly. And all these words, by the way, were taken from the same sample essay that we worked on just a second ago for the previous examples. And anyway, don't get too bogged down in worrying about whether words are adjectives or adverbs or whether you could use the word very to describe the words or not. That isn't really, of course, what matters when you're writing your essay. What matters when you're writing the essay is that you just lock on to specific words and phrases used to trigger particular emotions in the reader. And all I'm doing here is giving you kind of a concrete way to do that. There are other ways to think about it too, or you might not even want a concrete way. You might just be like, oh, when I read this, I feel happy. Let me see if I can find the words that make me feel happy, and then I'll talk about those. Or when I read this part of the passage, I feel anxious. Let me find the specific phrases that create that feeling of anxiety, and then I'll talk about those. You can do it that way if you want, kind of using your instincts, or you can think in terms of this test with describing words in terms of the word very. However you want to do it. I'm just trying to give you a bunch of different tools to draw from. And now let's go back to selections of the same essay that we just used a minute ago for the evidence and reasoning examples, and let's talk about those paragraphs in terms of the emotional stuff we might look at on test day. Once more, this is the provided prompt by the College Board for that passage. And once more, I will remind you that the thesis, according to the College Board, is everything after the word that in this sentence, which is the statement, the decline of reading in America will have a negative effect on society. And here I've just pulled out various paragraphs from this essay. And we're not going to bother reading all of this text because, first of all, it would take a lot of time and my mouth gets tired when I read large blocks of text out loud. And secondly, perhaps more importantly, since all we're talking about in these examples is the emotional aspect of the text rather than the specific meaning of the text, at this stage, we arguably don't need to read through word by word and sentence by sentence anyway, because we just want to pull out strong words and phrases at this point, and then we can think about how to describe what those words and phrases are doing when we try to write about it in our essay. So just kind of as we're going through this, I see the word crucial, which is basically like very important, extremely important. Troubling, which is very bad. Here we have this word severe again, like we just mentioned on the previous screen. The word worrisome, also just mentioned on the previous screen. Here we have the word serious, the word strong, and noble here, meaning like very good, basically. And then down here we have some of the words that we noted earlier, actually, in the evidence and reasoning example. The ideas of being informed, active, free, innovative. Innovative, of course, meaning something like very creative, very insightful in a particular kind of way. So now that we've sort of identified some of those strongly emotional words, let's think about how they're being used. It kind of looks like the author uses negative words like troubling, severe, worrisome, and so on to describe the trends related to young people. And the ideas related to being a member of a society and so on, and encouraging reading, seem to have more positive words associated with them, like noble work and innovative and so on. And so as we think about that and reflect on it, we might come up with some text like this for the body paragraph on emotional stuff. And once more, just like with all the other sample text I'm giving you as things that I might write if this were test day, you shouldn't feel bad if you wouldn't have written about these particular words in this particular way. Maybe your thing would have been a lot better, a lot longer, who knows? But my example here is just to kind of help you get thinking about it. So I might have written, powerful adjectives and adverbs are included throughout the argument as Gioia works to make the reader grasp the life and death importance of the issues at hand. He describes the decline in reading activity as worrisome and severe, causing the reader to feel anxiety over a future with even less appreciation. You would never know I wrote that myself. Anyway, with even less appreciation for literature as the identified trend continues. On the other hand, he uses very positive language when discussing the noble work done by champions of reading as they try to keep America informed, active, independent-minded, free, innovative, and productive. Associating literacy with the highest possible ideals, this approach makes the reader want the decline to end so that a better society can still be saved. And so you can see here that I used the terms adjectives and adverbs, but you wouldn't have to use that. You could just say something like powerful ideas are included throughout the argument, or powerful words even, or say something like Gioia writes powerfully, or whatever. You could make it your own. And for that matter, you don't have to use the word powerful, but you get the idea. What I've basically done in this paragraph is identify some of these particularly emotional words, and then just given a straightforward description of what those words do, what they make the reader feel, and why the author uses them in that way. And that's basically that. And so now that we've seen some kind of real-life examples of how we can talk about the emotional tactics used by the author of a passage, as well as the logical structure that appears in SAT essay passages, let's go ahead and wrap up this video. So it's important to remember how the ideas we just talked about in this video tie back into the concepts and strategies from the first video. As you'll recall from that video, I recommended that you use a modified version of the 5-paragraph essay format. And as part of that, I recommended that your last body paragraph be the one focused on the author's appeal to emotion or pathos, pathos, whatever. And all the earlier body paragraphs be based on this kind of evidence and reasoning structure talked about earlier. And the main reason for that, as with the main reason for everything else I tell you to do on the SAT, is that I've seen a lot of high-scoring essays do basically that with their body paragraphs. So that's where the kinds of concepts from this video could be plugged into that first video. And I want to remind you one more time, you don't actually have to use the specific terms that I've been using, like reasoning or evidence or emotion or whatever, if you don't want to. But I've just been referring to them throughout the video to kind of help make it more clear what I was trying to say. If you want to just think in terms of what and why and how when it comes to the sort of logical aspects of your discussion, of course, that's great. And for the emotional stuff, if you want, one way to do it, like we talked about, is just to look out for strong adjectives and adverbs. In other words, things that could be sort of redefined with a 2-word definition, including the word very, like the way we said severe means very serious. Then you can certainly use that framework for identifying emotional stuff. Or, as I also said, you could just read a couple of sentences and think, okay, well, how does that make me feel emotionally? And then think, okay, when I read that, I felt a little bit, I don't know, optimistic, for example. So what were the specific words and phrases that made me feel optimistic? And then I can talk about that in my emotion-based body paragraph. There are a lot of ways to arrive at your own idea of what the emotional impact of the passage is and why you think that. And any of those approaches can work, of course. You just need to make sure that at some point you talk about the emotional dimension of the author's argument. And that's pretty much all I have to say in this video, except make sure to watch the other videos, because this video by itself definitely doesn't stand alone as a full explanation of how to attack the SAT essay, of course. So you'll definitely want to make sure you watch that first video giving sort of the overview and the general process I recommend that you follow. And then, of course, watch also the third video where I walk you through real top-scoring essays provided by the College Board and sort of deconstruct how the authors of those essays wrote in a way that conforms to all the stuff you learned in this video and in the first one. So, thanks as always for watching this, and I will see you in that third video.